Castello-Lynn. I'm currently Vice President of the Berkeley Historical Society. And on behalf of the Berkeley Historical Society Museum, I would like to welcome you to today's discussion of Deborah Cadbury's 2022 book, The School That Escaped the Nazis. And for today's event, it is my great pleasure to introduce Emmy Award-winning journalist Linda Schacht and former Berkeley auditor Anna Rabkin. Linda has worked as a television reporter in San Francisco at KQED and KPIX before teaching broadcast journalism at Cal. Anna served as Berkeley's auditor from 1979 to 1994. Linda and Anna also share a long-standing connection to our Berkeley Public Libraries. 22 years ago, Anna, then president of the Berkeley Library Foundation, asked Linda to organize an author's dinner to raise badly needed funds to remodel Berkeley's central and branch libraries. Linda agreed to do that, and she is still emceeing those authors' dinners. The 20th just happened on March 4th, and the events have raised millions of dollars for the Berkeley Public Libraries. Since Anna and Linda were brought together in part by a love of libraries and a belief in the importance of books, it is fitting today that Anna and Linda will be delving into a book which tells a story which should not be forgotten. I will let Linda introduce Anna more fully before they discuss the story told by Deborah Cadbury's The School That Escaped the Nazis, a story which is also Anna's story.
Hello, everyone. Anna Rabkin is not only a character in Deborah Cadbury's book. She has a book herself, and it was called From Krakow to Berkeley, Coming Out of Hiding. The very first words in Anna's book are these: I am one of the lucky few who survived the Second World War in the formerly Polish city of Lvov. Anna, you were a beneficiary of the movement called the Kinder Transports that got you out of Germany, out of Poland, and to a place that you have called the place that saved your life. Can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, thank you to the Berkeley Historical Society for inviting us. Yes, the Kinder Transport history is quite interesting. It actually started after World War I, because after World War I, there was tremendous famine in Central and Eastern Europe. And Herbert Hoover, who became President Hoover, was very, very active in famine relief. He was from a Quaker family. And the Quakers in Europe were very active, especially one woman by the name of Bertha Bracy. And the Quakers organized a tremendous famine relief program for children. They fed about 5 million children during that time. So some of those children became leaders of the Nazi Party. And they remembered the benevolence of the Quakers during that terrible time of famine. So when the Nazis gained power in Germany, one of the few humanitarian organizations that was allowed to operate in Germany were the Quakers. So what happened in 1938 after November Kristallnacht, there was a tremendous outpouring of outrage in Britain. And Bertha Bracy put together a delegation of Quakers, some Jewish organizations, to go to Berlin and to try and figure out how to help to get Jewish children out of Germany. They met with in Berlin with a refugee committee there and a wealthy businessman. And they came up with this incredible plan to get children of the age of 16, up to the age of 16, out of Germany through Holland, which after Kristallnacht had told them that they would be accepting people coming from, refugees coming from Germany. The big issue was how to get them into England. It was just a ferry ride, really, from Holland to England. So they went back to London. By that time, British public sympathy had really gained momentum. And
against the Nazis.
Against the Nazis after Kristallnacht. They were so outraged about what had happened during the Kristallnacht. So it just so happened that the Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, was also a Quaker. And so they were able to talk to him and persuade him that Britain should help these children. And he recognized that it would be a sort of big gesture that the British would feel very proud of doing. So he persuaded Prime Minister Chamberlain at that time to allow children in. So Parliament basically allowed these children just 11 days after Kristallnacht. They voted to allow children up to the age of 16 to come to Britain.
And there were some 10,000 children that were transported, correct?
Close to 10,000. But actually, Britain didn't put a
Limit.
cutoff, a cap. Sadly, in the United States, there was a similar bill that was being discussed in committee and never made it out of committee. So the United States never took any of the children. So then the British Quakers and the Jewish refugee committees swung into action. They had to then plan how to get these children out, how to select them, and where to put them. So the first train left Germany on November 30
Of
1938.
38.
So just, 20 days after Kristallnacht. And the German railways named the movement Kindertransport. So once the trains were going, of course, in England, they were working like crazy. Where do we put these children? So, when you think about the children at our southern border and who were separated from their parents, the same thing was happening with the Kindertransport children. They were being separated from their parents. Anna Essinger, who became the principal of Banskort School that we'll talk about later, had worked with the Quakers during the famine period after World War I. And so she was called and asked to, she was a very good organizer. So she was called to organize one of these places that would accept the children. And they did something very clever. In England, there are a lot of summer, or there were, I don't know whether they still exist. There were a lot of summer camps. There were, one of the big ones was Butlin's summer camp. They were very famous, very inexpensive seaside summer camps. So they basically leased a whole bunch of these summer camps, which of course were not weatherproofed. They were summer. So during the winter, this was a terrible situation. But in any case, they brought the children to those summer camps. And Anna Essinger was in charge of one of them, Dover Court. And that was a huge organizational task to get these children settled, to try and find foster parents. So the BBC put out a call for foster parents, and a lot of English people responded. There was a huge fundraising effort. Both, they raised over £1 million, which in those days was a lot of money, both from small, just little contributions, and from very wealthy people. And one of the big donors were the Cadbury family, which was the chocolate family, also Quakers.
And the author of the book we're talking about is one of those family members.
Deborah Cadbury is a family member of the Cadburys. And so that's how they funded these places. What happened then was that the foster parents had to go to these camps and choose the children. And Anna Essinger, I will call her Tante Anna because we all called her Tante Anna, was outraged because it was like a meat market. And so she put in place a different selection process. Most of the foster parents wanted young children. They were very keen to have blonde, blue-eyed girls. And teenage boys were really at a disadvantage. Very few families wanted teenage boys.
Some things never change.
Right. And so a lot of the teenage boys ended up in hostels all over Britain. And many of them went to work in factories which were gearing up for the war. What happened then was really ironic because in May of 1940, there was tremendous propaganda about the enemy within. There were about 70,000 refugees from Italy and from Germany, mostly Jewish, but some none, who had come after Hitler took power. And they had settled from 33 to 38. They had settled in England. They were working. They were contributing to the economy. But there was such a panic when Holland fell in May of 1940 that by then, Winston Churchill was prime minister. He was convinced to call these refugees enemy aliens. And so any German or Italian male over the age of 16 and up to the age of 60 was arrested. They were arrested and they were interned. It just so happens that I had a cousin who was German and who had been taken out of one of the concentration camps, Sachsenhausen, by the Quakers, who were allowed to take 14 boys out of Sachsenhausen.
Why did the Germans allow the Quakers to take children out of the camps?
Kristallnacht was a huge public relations problem for the Germans. And so when they allowed the Quakers to come and visit Sachsenhausen, they did so because they wanted to show that, these campers were having a wonderful time, that they were just working and,
Public relations.
And when the Quakers asked to take some of the children out, they said, of course you can, So it was all public relations because they realized that they didn't want the world to know the criminal activities because it was prior to the war still. they didn't want the world to know the criminal activities that in these concentration camps were already happening. So my cousin ended up in one of these hostels, was working in a factory, and one day the police came, they arrested them, all 14, and they were interned in a camp on the Isle of Man. And then a few days later, they were shipped off to Australia. And several of the students at Bunscourt School, again, teenagers, German males, and a couple of the teachers were interned on the Isle of Man, shipped to Australia, and one of the teachers went with them because he said, I'm not allowing my students to go by themselves. So the ship that they were on, the Dunera, is a very famous, actually a film has been made and books have been written because it was an absolutely brutal crossing, 57 days, and they were, the sailors didn't know the difference between, there were some German POWs, there were some German fascists, English fascists, and most of the people were Jewish refugees. But the sailors had no idea that there was any difference. And when they arrived in Australia, people were just absolutely amazed. They thought they were getting soldiers, POWs, and instead they got these men coming off the ship with wearing yarmulkes and fedoras and suits. They were totally amazed by this. So it was pretty ironic, that the Kindertransport children who had escaped from Germany, who were welcomed by the British, and then a few months later, they were interned. Fortunately, when the story about the Dunera came out, Churchill said this was wrong. We have to get these people back. So some of the internees only spent about 9 months or so. Some spent several years because it took a long time, to unwind this whole procedure that they had put in place. So, yeah, the Kindertransport children really were traumatized, not only because
repeatedly.
Yeah.
Anna, I think we need to go back to your story.
Okay.
And give us a little background on where you were at the time and how you managed to get to England. What happened to your family?
Okay. So my brother and I spent the war years in hiding. My parents, unfortunately, were discovered. They were not hiding with us. They were in a different place. They were discovered 4 months before the war ended. So
tell the story of where they were and what happened there.
So my parents were in an apartment where the woman who owned the apartment had built a hiding place, a sort of false wall, tiny little place where there was just a bed. And the only way they could get out, there was an opening, and a chest of drawers stood in front of this opening. So at night,
so your parents were in this closet.
They were in this closet.
Okay.
And unfortunately, the woman who hid them was an alcoholic, and she loose lips when she was in a bar. Somebody picked up that she was getting money, and where do you get money? Somebody was paying her. So there were bounties for Jews. So somebody from that bar went to the Gestapo and said, well, as far as we know, they suspected her. So the Gestapo came, they took her away. I understand she was shot, and they sealed the apartment. And the chest of drawers was in front of the opening, and there was no way for my parents to get out. So as far as we know, they died in the place.
And at that point, you were where?
We were in hiding in Lvov, which is on the eastern part of Poland. And
You and your brother, I should mention your brother, Arthur.
My brother, who was older than I was. So he sort of became my substitute father. And then after the war, we were discovered by the Jewish committee that was looking for survivors. And they asked our caretakers whether they could take us back to Krakow, where we were from, and where they had discovered a cousin of ours had survived. But our caretakers refused because they would only give us up to a relative. So my brother and the committee guy who was trying to get us out figured out a plan to have us escape, which we did. And we were fortunate to be able to go back to Krakow with a group of children that they had discovered that had survived. When we got to Krakow, my cousin looked after us, and she and my grandmother, who had been in Siberia in a labor camp, survived, somehow managed to get back to Krakow. And the two of them were absolutely determined to get us out of Poland because my grandmother was very anti-communist. So they arranged with my cousin in London, my cousin Herta, who is quite heroic in my mind, to get us on one of the kinder transports that were operating after the war.
You wrote in your book that you were afraid of going because nothing good had happened to you so far. And there were so many changes and so many unknowns that it made you fear going. But your grandmother said to you, you will get a good education. The English were our friends during the war, and they are not anti-Semites like the Poles. That was her reasoning. And that was what compelled them to want you to go.
Right. And so I thought that I was being sent away because I had done something terrible. Mm-hmm. You know, a small child. I didn't understand any of this. And I was terrified because I didn't speak English and I didn't know cousin Herta, and I didn't know whether she would like me or not. You know, everything that a child goes through, right? And we arrived in England in a horrible, horrible weather. My first impression of England was, cold and foggy, and people were very uptight. I wasn't happy. And
you wrote that you were, in the first months, you were filled with loneliness, and you were also scared of Anna Essinger, Tante Anna.
Right. So Herta took my brother and I to this school, and she knew about the school because she had worked with the refugee committee, and her two younger sisters had come on the first kinder transport from Germany and were at that school. So she managed to get us into that school. So the first day we went, she came with us, and we arrived just at lunchtime. and had to sit with Tante Anna at the dining room table with some other of the teachers. And we were the only two children, it was all grown-ups. So I was terrified. And the lunch consisted of boiled potato, boiled fish, and boiled vegetable that I had never seen in my life before. Well, I knew about boiled potatoes. I had never eaten boiled fish, and I tasted this vegetable. It was slimy. It was just awful. It was a leek. I had never eaten anything like it. And so I knew I couldn't eat it. And I knew that you never left anything on your plate because food was so precious. Mm-hmm. So while the adults were talking, I took this leek and I slipped it under the table. And then I sat there frozen with fear because I was so afraid that I wouldn't be accepted at the school because somebody would, notice that I had thrown away food.
You've also said that you were a child who spoke in whispers and was afraid to talk to anyone. Is that true?
Well, during the war, we were told not to speak, to just whisper, because during the time we were hidden, it was so dangerous that if anybody heard a child, it would be a red flag. So I lost my voice. I just whispered. And I was really, really scared of talking. So when I was at school, I never spoke up. Only if a teacher pointed at me and said, "You have to answer," I would whisper in my head.
At this point, you were how old?
When I came to England, I was 11.
Mm-hmm. And the school had an unusual curriculum and approach to teaching children who were obviously traumatized. What was it like?
Anna Essinger was part of a reform movement in education. She had actually studied prior to World War I at the University of Wisconsin. And she was very, very taken with John Dewey's philosophy of education. And that actually, it was in Wisconsin that she met her first Quakers and became very taken with their value system and the principles of Quakerism. So when she went back to Germany, she worked during the famine with the Quakers, and then she became a liaison for the Quakers with the German schools. And she visited hundreds of schools during that time and recognized that German traditional education was wrong. It wasn't the best way to teach children. So in 1923, just as during the 1920s, there was a reform movement as far as government was concerned. There was also a reform movement as far as education was concerned. So she was part of the reform movement in education. She was corresponding with A.S. Neal, who was the headmaster of the famous Summerhill School in England, which he started in 1923. In 1926, Tante Anna, started her school in Hurlingen in Germany, near Ulm, which is where she was born and where Einstein was born. And her school was based on the principles that children learn best when they are doing things. So the focus was on the children being active, doing things and learning through doing. Also very much involved with outdoor activities and sports, but not particularly competitive sports. And so when she evacuated her school in 1933, when Hitler came to power, she basically smuggled 65 students out of Germany into England.
And wasn't there a moment that triggered that when she felt the pressure to start every school day with Heil Hitler,
right,
by the children?
Right. She knew that she couldn't do that. And she knew that because her school was based on such broad-minded principles, that they would never allow her to continue doing that. So that's why she basically left. And so when she got to Kent, where Bunscourt School started, she continued that way of getting the children very active in running the school. They were doing, they were helping cook, they were polishing the floors, sweeping the classrooms,
Working in the garden,
looking after the chickens. And the teachers used all of those activities as a learning, a sparking learning.
mm-hmm.
Not to say there wasn't classroom education, of course there was, but a lot of it came from the actual activities of the children. And then, of course, these children, the first group, what I call the phase one, which was in 1933, those children thought that they were going back home to their parents. They thought that this was just sort of temporary thing. And so she made it feel like home. She wanted them to think of the school as their temporary home, and so to look after it the way they would look after their home. Of course, those children most probably weren't looking after their home, because middle-class German children tended to have lots of servants and so on. But
you've said that she was the perfect teacher. This was the perfect approach for a traumatized child such as yourself.
I think so, because she made us, first of all, she made us feel safe. I mean, that was incredibly important, because all of us, the Kindertransport 1938 children who had seen horrible things happening in Germany and Austria, and then the third phase children like me who came after the war, had experienced dreadful things during the war. Danger was our daily experience. Mm-hmm. So to make us feel safe in an environment that was so beautiful, Kent is one of the most beautiful.
Describe the school physically, what it looked like.
Well, when I arrived at that first day, and I saw the main house, which was Bunscourt School was an estate, 26-acre estate. So the main house was the sort of manor house. It was so beautiful. I thought I had walked into a fairy tale. I just couldn't believe that, coming from where I came from.
And all you'd seen.
I could live in a place like that. It was surrounded by orchards. Kent is full of cherry trees, apple trees, beautiful woods, sheep farms. We were in the countryside. It was totally rural. there was a little tiny village about 1.5 miles from us, and there was one little store, general store, where we'd go and buy snacks and things. And the grounds were beautiful. During the 30s, the senior students had built an amphitheater because Anna Essinger felt that theater concerts were a very important part of education. And so they had built this beautiful amphitheater for about 300 people. And so music was always around us. She felt music was very important part of our life. And the classes were small, 10, 15
and her part of her philosophy was that the children and the teachers were equals.
Very much so. Though it was mostly sort of like even though I was in elementary school, it was very much like a seminar. It was a conversation. Obviously, there were some lectures, but very, very minimal. And I think that the sort of communal nature of always being around other children and adults who were looking after us, we felt very protected.
And could you feel yourself, in terms of your emotions and your mental state, improving as time went by there? Was it sudden? Was it a long period of time?
It's hard to say. Healing is a process and it takes a long time. But I can pinpoint one situation which was very, very important for me. When I was in Poland, I was really afraid to be out in public because even after the war, kids would throw stones at us and insult us and be really nasty. So sometimes they would attack us. But in the countryside, it was so quiet and people were so friendly. They would wave to us, when we went on walks in the country. So one day I got up my courage. There were beautiful woods around the school. It was spring. And I decided I was going to take a walk in the woods. And that was huge because I was afraid of woods, because I was brought up on fairy tales and terrible things happened in the woods. And I came across this glade where there were crocuses and primroses and snowdrops and bluebells. And it was a revelation for me. I mean, I was just stunned. And that moment gave me a feeling of something had turned. I wasn't afraid. And that was very important. But that was not to say that I was healed overnight.
Right.
It was just every day, things got better. Learning how to speak English.
And you had English-speaking roommates.
And
you did not speak English when you got there.
I didn't speak at all. All of the children, there were 6 of us in my room. There was one girl who was English because the school accepted English children as well as refugees. And Tante Anna asked the sports master, the coach, very nice young man, Englishman, to be my tutor. And he very wisely used a fairy tale book to teach me English. And the first story was my favorite fairy tale, which was Hansel and Gretel, because I always thought my brother was Hansel. He had saved me. And so I learned English from fairy tales. And then I tried to speak to my roommates using these new words I had learned, like pebbles and brook. And of course, they were laughing because, but slowly I learned. One of the worst moments about English was the English girl who had rather a salty mouth. And it was bloody this and bloody that, and you bastard. And one day, somebody took a book off my bed, a Polish book I was reading. And I was really upset. And I knew that these words, were sort of bravado. So I said, "Give me back my book, oh, you bloody bastard." I had no idea what these words meant. And she went to Tante Anna and told her. And Tante Anna got us to come to her room. And she looked at me and she said, "Did you know those were nasty words?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Do you know what they mean?" I said, "No." She said, "Will you promise never to use those words again?" I said, "Yes." She said, "If you ever use those words again, I'm going to have to let you go." So, of course, I was terrified. And then she made me say sorry to the other girl, and we shook hands, and that was it. But, she was the principal, and I was convinced that, I could get expelled. So I became so careful about what words I used.
The relationships that you formed with some of those students have continued, and you've had reunions in Berkeley a couple of times.
In Berkeley only once, in 2005.
And what did you talk about with the others, and what effect did the school have on them that you recognize?
Well, it was interesting. About 25 alums came with their spouses from all over Northern America, from Canada, East Coast, South. So it was quite amazing that they felt so strongly about the school that they would make that trip. It turned out that only I and Sam Oliner were post-World War II alums. We were about 70 at that time, but we were the youngest of the group, so that we were considered youngsters.
You knew him in the school as well.
I knew him. Sam was my brother's best friend at the school. They continued their friendship as long as Sam lived. He died in 2021. And Sam was an incredible guy. He had survived the war as a farmhand in Poland, escaped by a hair from losing his life, traumatized, arrived in Bundscourt, had a very difficult time, but made it through, eventually emigrated to the United States, married, and then came to California. So when I arrived in the Bay Area, he was living in Piedmont. Shortly after that, he bought Kaufman's Fabrics on University Avenue and owned it for a number of years until he decided he wanted an education. He had never gone to college. Went to UC, ended up getting a PhD in sociology, became a professor at Humboldt State, started an altruism institute in Arcata at Humboldt, wrote many books, most of them trying to understand what made people altruistic. So he came to this reunion. He knew some of the other people. I didn't. Everybody who came just remembered those years at Bundscourt as one of the best times of their lives. And the fact that they were treated with such dignity by the teachers, and that they were given such responsibilities and proud. They were proud that they were able to handle things that most teenagers don't. All of them did very well. They were all professionals. And we talked a lot about the fact that Anna Essinger, Tante Anna, always told us, you have to speak English. Forget whatever language you came from. You have to look to the future. Don't talk about the past. You have to try to assimilate to the British society, the British culture. Now, as we met, we talked about that. Was that the right thing to do? Mm-hmm. And nowadays, you would question that approach. But at that time, I think it saved our lives. I don't know that she could have done what she did if she had allowed us to constantly go back to the past, mm-hmm. revisit what we had gone through, allowed us to continue talking in whatever language. Because most of us were able to take the seniors were able to take the high school leaving exams and did very well.
The subtitle of your book is Coming Out of Hiding. Was that a reference to physically coming out of hiding, or to a more mental or emotional coming out of hiding?
Both. Coming out of hiding, escaping from hiding was a big step in my life. But emotionally, I was a hidden child. I didn't trust anybody. I was afraid of authority figures. I mean, I was just, I was frozen, numb. Mm-hmm. It took a long time before, if somebody asked me, how are you feeling? I would look at them and say, what do you mean? I didn't know what that meant. Mm-hmm. So it took a long time for me to be able to begin to unthaw, to trust people. So I think that moment in the woods that spring was the first moment of trusting the environment, the physical environment, and some of the teachers that were at Bunscourt were so warm and so protective that I started to feel okay with them. Mm-hmm. And so that, it was a long process of getting out of the icebox.
Yeah. The last words in your book are, the Nazis tried to eradicate me and everyone like me. I was scared by the experience, but not destroyed. You ultimately got to Berkeley, and from a child who was afraid of public speaking or trying to talk to groups of people, you became a politician and were the auditor of the city of Berkeley for how long?
15 years.
15 years. What a success story. What a triumph.
Thank you. Well, Berkeley definitely changed my life. There's no question about that. I always think about my life as being a series of escapes from one place to another.
Yeah.
When I got to Berkeley, I knew I would never have to escape. It was such a welcoming community and such a really tolerant community. Nobody asked me, where are you from? Are you Jewish? It didn't seem to matter to people. Mm-hmm. That was incredibly freeing. And then, of course, having, I was a very late blooming student. I didn't go to college until I was in my 30s.
Late 30s.
Very late 30s.
Yeah.
And, you know, the opportunities that were offered to me, I mean, were just amazing.
And you grabbed the brass ring and went with it.
Yeah. And of course, Marty was a wonderful support. There he is.
There he is.
He was the man of my dreams. I have 2 children I'm very proud of, 2 granddaughters who are living a young life that is so different from my young life that it's just so interesting for me to watch them, you know, unfold, their lives unfolding. And, you know, during retirement, I have such an enriched retirement life, writing and making new friends and traveling.
Are you planning another book?
I am.
Good. What will be the topic?
My thesis, when I got my graduate degree in history, was about a Polish woman who was a journalist and a biographer. And during the 50s, she wrote biographies that were well internationally known, translated into many, many languages. Her name is Antonina Valentin. And a very interesting woman, very political. I think I'm sort of going to take off from my thesis and develop a book about her.
Thank you, Anna. I think we should take some questions from the chat, if there are any. I really appreciate your sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
And also with Deborah Cadbury for her book. Let's take a look and see if we have some questions. Great. Anna has said that she wonders that there aren't more schools organized as Bunce Court was. Could she talk about how present day schools might become more like Bunce Court?
Well, I am a believer in Tante Anna's philosophy that children learn by doing. So I wish that our schools would give children much more of an opportunity to do things during class time and to be out in the community doing things. The seniors in Bunce Court often worked on the farms around the school. A lot of them became apprentices in different organizations when they left the school. And I just feel that that practical aspect of life is missing from our schools. I think that education, now that we have this incredible technology, really has to change. The classrooms have to be much more interactive than they have been in the past.
At Bunce Court, each child had their own plot of land to care for?
We each had a little plot of land. I sowed mine with radishes because I love radishes. And I learned the bitter lesson that rabbits love radishes too. So I never had a harvest. But yes, we were taught about, taking care of the soil, watering, talking about the plants, the different parts of the plants. So we were learning biology.
Real life skills.
By having a little plot of land, and we were taught about chickens and eggs.
Let's see. Will this recording be available to watch later? I believe so, on the website of the Berkeley Historical Society. Yes, yes. Feel free to restore your videos at this point. That was not a question. Let's see what, I can't quite see the next question.
Can you see the messages?
Where can you see the messages?
Yes.
Recording.
Okay. I'll, if I might, so there was a question at the beginning. Somebody was asking Anna what your parents did as professions before the war. Can you tell us a little bit about your family?
Right. My father, surprisingly, went to law school in Krakow, surprisingly, because the university in Krakow, which is a very old and highly regarded university, allowed maybe 2 or 3 Jewish students in the law school. And he developed a practice. His law office was actually in our apartment. And I always tell that my love for libraries actually started at the age of 3, because he had his law library in the apartment. And I loved going there because it had a ladder, so you could travel around the shelves. So I thought that was a great ride. My mother's parents owned a factory that made bricks and tiles. And the workers in the, one of my relatives was a union organizer. He was a communist, and he tried to organize the workers in my grandfather's factory. So the amusing thing about my father's involvement was that he was the lawyer for this factory. But when my cousin got arrested by the police when they tried to strike the factory, my father had to bail him out from prison. So, he was on both, had to deal with both sides. When the Russians came, when the Russians occupied the eastern part of Poland, anybody who was an intellectual or professional was considered subversive by the Russians, and they were shipped off to Siberia. Well, my father had 2 strikes against him because he was an officer in the Polish army and he was a lawyer. So during the Russian occupation of Poland, eastern part of Poland, he was hunted, and he often had to go into hiding. And in a way, one of the hiding places was the place that my brother and I eventually were hidden. He became friendly with the couple who owned that apartment because both my father and they hated the Russians. And so that brought them together, and they became friends. And then when we were sent into the ghetto, it was that
Your brother and you.
My whole family was sent to the
family.
ghetto. That couple, or that man really, got in touch with my father, and they planned how to get us out, my brother and I.
How did that happen?
It was very traumatic because we were in the ghetto for quite a while, over a year. A German soldier came into our room, and he had a big canvas sack, and my mother told me that I had to get into the sack. And she said, "It's going to be all right, don't worry," and said goodbye. Well, you can imagine, I was 9 years old. I was terrified. He took me over his shoulder and walked out. and walked out of the ghetto with me in the sack. And there was a truck, and my brother was among some other sacks, and he drove us out into the Gentile part of town, dropped us on a street corner. And my brother knew where we were going. I did not. And we walked about a block to this house where this couple lived. And once we were in that room, we never went out again.
Who was the person who carried you in a sack?
A German soldier who my father bribed, I assume quite significantly.
Yeah. Okay. Do you see, Janine, any other questions that we could take?
How do you
How do you think your experience affected your own kid's life? That's a good question.
Yeah. I tried very hard not to talk a lot about my past life. Obviously, they knew the outlines of it. And I think that because they went to Berkeley public schools, they read Anne Frank's diary and other books about the Holocaust. So I think they put things together. I think that they felt that I was very protective of them and thought that was probably that had to do with my past. But I don't think that they really knew all the detail. I know they didn't know all the details until they read my book.
Interesting. Let's see what else there is.
Also, at the very beginning, I'll just mention that Grace also asked Anna whether she could have your email. She says that she is a university professor in education. It sounds like she'd like to communicate with you. So I guess if you could write in the chat directly to Grace, if you want to give her your email.
Sure, I have no problem.
Good.
Okay.
Do you see any other questions, Janine?
No, I don't. I guess I might ask, maybe we should explain a little more about the structure of the school that escaped the Nazis, that it is a history, sort of a blow-by-blow history of what happened in Germany to the Jews, very chilling history. But part of it at the end is, interspersed is Deborah Cadbury's interviews with students. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that part, because, so Anna, you were one of the students who was interviewed, and there were quite a few others who were interviewed.
So, including Olander.
Sam Olander,
right.
So she interviewed, I think, about 4 senior boys, Sam Olander and 3 others. One of them was an English student, because I think she wanted to show that it wasn't just refugee children. There were children, English children, who came to the school. The school was considered very progressive. So the children who came to the school, for instance, there were 2 girls who I admired greatly, Anna and Natalie John. And they were the grandchildren of Augustus John, who was a very well-known painter, portrait painter. In fact, his portrait of Winston Churchill, I think, might be the official portrait of Winston Churchill. In any case, the interviews with the children, I think, are very important, because it's very rare that you get Holocaust history from children's point of view. So that, I think, was an addition to Holocaust history. I was the only girl that she interviewed, because I was the only girl survivor after the war. There were very few girls who survived the Holocaust.
Why was that? Why was the difference between girls and boys?
They killed off girls very, very fast. Some of the girls survived in convents. They were taken in by nuns. Some survived, like I did, in hiding. But most were picked up and sent to concentration camps and didn't survive.
Mm-hmm.
Boys survived more because, again, some of them were able to be part of the resistance. And so they were living off the land, in the forests and so on. And perhaps they were stronger.
Put to work as well.
Well, some of them were working, in different places if they could pass as Gentiles.
Mm.
Yeah.
You mentioned to me the other day when we were talking about this interview that you have always felt that you had a lucky star following you. And certainly that was not the case in those early years, but it's a strange thing to say about someone who had to live through what you lived through as well.
Yeah. Right. So the early part of my life was difficult, no question about that. It was sad. I lost my parents. I lost most of my family. But I must, when I look back, I was so fortunate. Even right after the war, my cousin looked after me in Poland. My cousin looked after me in England. I was adopted by my relatives in New York.
At what age was that? When did you get to New York?
I got to New York I was about 18, 19, 19, I think. And I was able to travel all over the world. I met a wonderful guy. I got a great education. I had really interesting jobs. I lived in this wonderful city. I mean, I can't complain, I just feel I am so fortunate. I do feel
comparatively.
Yeah.
Well, Janine, I think you had some more comments. I want to thank Anna again for willingness to talk to us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
To both of you. This has been really so interesting and moving. So yes, and Anna is continuing to give back to Berkeley. I know about that part, and you recently wrote a long article about Berkeley women who've contributed significantly to the environmental movement, and you allowed us to put it in our last newsletter. It's on the front page, and I think Anne Harlow is going to put a virtual link to that in our chat. Here's a picture of it. That's Anna Rabkin in 1982. And Anne will put a link to a virtual version of our newsletter in the chat. And if you'd like,
I actually forgot to do that, have that ready to go. But you can always just go to our website, berkhistory.org, and then under Explore Berkeley History, look at newsletters.
Okay. All right. Yes.
I'll stop share.
Okay. So I know Anna is involved with another group called FAB, and which I guess is Berkeley Women.
Berkeley. The whole name is Free Agents at Berkeley, but we call ourselves FAB, not the FAB 4, but FAB at 64.
Okay. Yes, and I'm delighted to hear you're going to write another book. That's wonderful. So yes, I guess that's I guess that about wraps it up. We do encourage you to check out the Berkeley Historical Society's website and consider joining, and then you'll get future newsletters and hear about our events. We are having a closing event. Our current exhibit is on Berkeley ecohistory, and we will have a closing event with special guest Malcolm Margolin, who's here today, I think, right now. And that will be on April 16th. Yeah.
With you.
So that will be in the afternoon from 2 to 4. And then we will have an opening of our next exhibit, which is Touching Ground, Putting Down Roots, Chinese in Berkeley. And that opening will be April 30th at 3 o'clock. And Harvey Dong of East Wind Bookstore, which is just about to close, will be speaking. And so both of those events will be in person at the Berkeley Historical Society in the Veterans Building.
May I just add that I think the Berkeley Historical Society and Museum is one of the hidden treasures of Berkeley that some people might not be aware of. But you do wonderful work and have wonderful displays, and more people should know about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So also, if you want to hear more from Anna, we do have some oral histories of hers on our website, and they're also on our YouTube channel. So you can either search YouTube for Anna Rabkin, and then you'll get quite a few things because other people have interviewed you too, Anna. Or you go to our website again under Exploring Berkeley History and then Oral Histories, and you'll find interviews that Michael Severall, who's here today, did with Anna Rabkin about her life. And also, somewhat related, we have 5 interviews with a Yiddish speaking and reading group, the Mamaloshan Mamas, which Michael recently did on our website. So, and also you can buy Anna's book. Anna, your book is right behind you on the shelf. Do you want to show people your own memoir? This, From Krakow to Berkeley, Coming Out of Hiding. So that's for sale at the Berkeley Historical Society, and I imagine also on Amazon. In fact, I looked it up. It is for sale on Amazon. And the book we were talking about, is that over there on your? Yes, it's a little. There it is.
In that blue bag right there.
The School That Escaped the Nazis, and that we do not have for sale, but it is available on Amazon. Yeah. And the cover looks a little different now. It's a newer cover. Yeah. But it's really a very worthy history of what happened to the Jews in Germany and Austria beginning in 1933 mostly. Yeah.
If I may mention, Deborah Cadbury, as I said, is from the chocolate family. And if you're a chocoholic, I highly recommend her other book, which is called Chocolate Wars. It's the history of chocolate and how the Cadburys and others entered that industry. It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Very chocolate. Anna happened to come across a Cadbury chocolate bar.
Oh,
but this was when we went to the little tiny store near Bunce Court. This was my favorite, absolute favorite, Cadbury's fruit and nut bar, and it's nowhere near as good anymore as it used to be.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you again to Anna and Linda. And we hope to see you on some future events. So thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.